Good evening, everyone. I'm Thane Rosenbaum, the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University, and in partnership and co-production with our longstanding producer partners, the New York Film Academy and their students that are watching around the country, especially in LA, because they have an animation division. Welcome to tonight's conversation series. And our special guest tonight is Michael Hirsh, who is a TV executive. So there's a TV executive in the house, ladies and gentlemen, who single-handedly built Canada, which had a wasteland certainly in children's and entertainment and animation, into the largest producer and distributor of animation and children's programming around the world. And we're going to talk a little about how he ended up doing that, essentially competing against Disney right out of college. He is the author of a new book that's out that I can tell you is enormously interesting. There it is. It's called Animation Nation, How We Built a Cartoon Empire. And that subtitle is no exaggeration. He really did build it. And it's got a really snappy animation cover to it. If you want to buy it, there's a QR code there that'll take you straight to it. You know Michael Hirsh and his various companies that he's owned through, are you ready for this? Wait for it. Cartoons from when you were a child, whether it was on Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network or Teletoon, I think in Canada, PBS, Star Wars cartoons, Beetlejuice, Mr. Gadget, Babar, Care Bear, Berenstain Bears, Arthur, The Magic School Bus. It goes on and on and on. In fact, one of our key producer here, Zach, was just telling Michael how much he loved Magic School Bus as a little kid. Generations of people have benefited from the cultural production of Michael's various companies. We're coming to you live tonight, as always, from our FOLCS studio, which you can find on our website. There are two buttons on the bottom. One is for a donation. We're always happy to receive those. But another one that may be more important, if you have a friend, family member who loved Arthur or Berenstain Bears or Babar or any number of the Michael Hirsh creations that he put into the mainstream culture, send them a link, tell them to watch. You get to see the guy who put these deals all together. If you have some questions at the end, maybe we'll take some time to take them. But first, let's meet Michael Hirsh. There he is. Hey, Michael.
Hi, Thane.
Say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. And Thane, thanks for having me on.
Of course. No, this is a real treat. We, as you know, we've had presidents and prime ministers and kings, and we've had Oscar winners and Nobel Prize winners and Pulitzer Prize winners, but we've never had a TV executive that did this kind of production that literally had a global impact, Michael. I mean, I think this is something you should be extraordinarily proud of. You did deals all over the world and made people happy and educated. In fact, I think one of your companies even had an education department that was independent from the animation, just the actual development of curricula. So let's start off with this sort of, you started off out of college with a bunch of friends, and you essentially took on Disney in a way. Just briefly tell us, you were up against the biggest David and Goliath story. Disney owned the world. And so what is it that you thought you could bring to it?
So I thought that, what me and my group could do was bring great quality animation back to TV. So Disney really wasn't doing much for TV in that era. It was before they started their TV division. They were making a movie every 5 years. So they really weren't having that big an impact on a regular basis. So the studio that we really had to confront and overcome was Hanna-Barbera, because at that point,
I remember them.
Yeah, Hanna-Barbera was doing about 80% of cartoons on American TV. And though they had started with great shows like the Flintstones and the Jetsons and Yogi Bear, they had declined in their quality of animation. They'd let it go down, and they became really just focused, I think, on milking the cow, making as much money as they could.
But also, those, if I'm not mistaken, I grew up on those too. Those were not thinking cartoons. It sounds like what you went into the business also of making kids smarter, making them aware of things. It wasn't just entertainment with you. Hanna-Barbera had a very different reputation than what you produced.
Yes, but in essence, what we were trying to do was not only put in greater quality, which we did, but you're right, we were making films that we thought everybody could watch. So they were really driven originally at the family. And essentially, we were, I think, doing a lot more sort of intellectual sort of exercise over what we put on the screen, how we told the stories, and making sure that the whole family could watch, because that was an era where families were still watching together.
Well, and we're going to get to that because, in fact, you completely transcended the entire experience of the way the culture was consuming film. And so we'll talk about that at some point because it is sort of fascinating. And I hope you'll also educate us a little in the early days of animation to where we are now. Canada didn't have anything. When I was a kid, what they really had that was really great was SCTV. And you ended up hiring, it sounds like more than half of the SCTV characters that I loved ended up working for you in some capacity as a voice, which I think was hilarious, including John Candy, Eugene Levy, and Catherine O'Hara. But at some point, did you go to the Minister of Culture in Canada and say, look what I'm doing here? Like I am building a business here, because it sounded like a lot of the deals that you put together were put together because of tax breaks, things that Canada recognized that you were doing in order to build a business that just didn't exist out of a wasteland.
So when we started, it was before Canada had all these cultural programs and incentives. Eventually, we were able to benefit from those programs. And no, we didn't really go to the Minister of Culture and say, hey, support us. We're part of the group's lobbying for support. But our thesis from the beginning was really self-sufficiency. And so as a studio, Nelvana, which was my first animation studio, we focused on breaking into the American market, a market that would pay for the shows and where we could compete, with our peers.
And one of the things the book does nicely is the level of perseverance, because you ended up building a behemoth, but in the beginning it was slow going. And this is a really great story for people watching. This man's success is extraordinary. There are essentially 6 different companies, different iterations, both private corporations and public corporations, that this man was the CEO for. And if you see the beginning of the book, this was rough. This was, at one point you had a camera in a toilet bowl, right?
Yeah. So the story I really have to share with you regarding the camera over the toilet bowl, not in, is that when I first met the woman who became my wife, I was telling her about what I did in the studio, and she came away thinking that, we were a little Disney. You mentioned Disney in the beginning, and she thought that's what I was doing. And so when she came to visit the studio for the first time, she was kind of like taken aback because there was a bathtub in the middle of a 3rd floor walk up. There was the camera in the toilet room, with a light in the toilet bowl so you could backlight. And she told me afterwards that she thought that the disconnect between reality and my vision was what would have to be the best to see.
He said, I don't want to show off, but I'm the head of a studio. And then you took her home. Tell us why animated films in your mind is important. I want to go through a little of the history of it itself, but just tell me why it's important. Maybe you can add into that. What is it that Disney in the beginning was trying to do? And you've already told us what you were trying to improve upon. But tell us why you think animated films are important.
So I think if you think back to the earliest of animation, it wasn't necessarily for children, but they were making funny shorts, right? And those shorts would play before theatrical feature films. And it was on the basis of building those shorts and the ability to do that animation that Disney eventually started to do his own feature films. So it was a build from that. And animation has always been a field that, where funny is money. And that clearly is one of the drivers. As
So
time had
Edison,
evolved,
who invented the camera, he didn't like, where did who's Emilius in France? Who's responsible for animation? Who's the godfather of that?
yeah,
Disney?
so no, it would be Winsor McKay. So he was actually a Canadian artist who did Gertie the Dinosaur. And he was able to do the first animation that we're familiar with. And he
Now,
eventually did some great cartoon strips. Nemo and Slumberland is the most famous.
and these, again, these were shorts that played. I think people, of a certain generation don't realize that when you used to go to a movie, there were shorts, including cartoons, and there was oftentimes a double feature that started with a B movie. And we'll talk
Yes.
about this later because you have some interesting things to say about the various screens and platforms we have now, because there was a time that an audience member really was captive to maybe 4 hours of sitting there of watching cartoons and shorts like the Three Stooges, and then sort of a not such a great movie, and then the feature movie, and the next thing you know, it's dinner time. So there was a Canadian who started this, but there is also some other idea I think that you say in the book is that animation is sort of a universal language, that it doesn't really even require in many ways subtitles, that the world is watching animation in the same way and seeing it in the same way, which isn't necessarily true in dramatic features or comedies.
Yeah, so I definitely thought of animation as a language that was easy to understand. And I always thought as we became aware that digital was going to come in, that animation would be the first medium that would look good on what became the internet, right? Because it was an abstract image, limited number of lines, limited amount of color, limited amount of audio effects, etc. So everything in animation is very carefully chosen and is carefully engineered, because unlike live action where you're shooting film of real people doing real things and they make real sounds, in animation it's all fantasy, it's all
But are
imagined.
you also saying that you get to use the whole screen?
That was one of the things that was critical in my falling in love with animation, was that as an artist, you could control the screen, whereas in live action, it's very hard to control everything on the screen. Despite your best efforts, there's always some uncontrollable factor. Whereas in animation, you're choosing and designing and selecting everything that people will see or hear.
So let's go back to Disney for a second and then to your creations. One of the things that I didn't understand in the book that I think the audience should know is that what you just said before about like digital must have been a massive improvement in how to produce these things. Because you described that you used to send even your own films. I couldn't tell what you were saying, that the actual painting of the films, that some of it was being done, that the production was being divided around the world and costs were cheaper. And that I think you said China or Taiwan, were they artists that were actually doing the drawings, or was that simply the colorization?
Those were artists, but in terms of our early work, for the first 10 years of the company's history, Nelvana's history, we did all the painting in Canada. We did it all in our own studio. We eventually started to go overseas when we did our first TV series, which was Inspector Gadget. And a series, in that case, we were doing 65 half hours, and we had to do them in 1 year. And it just wasn't possible to do it all in our little studio. So
And
we
that's why
went.
you started shipping things out.
Yes, so series work and then even feature films required it, because in the early days where we painted in-house, it actually cost us as much to paint a show as it did to animate it.
Can you
And
explain what paint means?
yeah, so in the early days of animation when I started, you would basically have artists who draw on paper, pencil on paper. Then it would go into what was essentially a Xerox room where it would get transferred from paper to acetate cell. The cell would get painted. And the cell, because it was transparent where there was no paint, would sit on top of a painted background. So there were a lot of artists who would work, hands-on on all those stages.
So they were painting on celluloid.
Yes, but
Wow,
not like a 16 millimeter.
I understand.
more like a 9 to 14 size piece of paper,
And
then
that's a reason why now. So when Disney used to promote the idea that the sharpness of the color, some of those original features, that again, that's old school animation, right? That was just paint, right? It's the
yes, and
quality.
you were always limited in the number of colors you could use because it increased the expense and the
Ah,
time. So that's why those early shows didn't have a lot of subtlety. And when you started to be able to do digital painting, that allowed you to use unlimited colors. And it really, I would say the image has improved because of that. And there used to be paint mistakes in every Disney film, no matter how great a film, there are paint errors that if you're from the industry, you can look
you
at
can
the film.
see it. You mentioned in the book, which I love because you were a philosophy major in college. And so you mentioned a few things. One person you mentioned, Marshall McLuhan, a fellow Canadian, who at one point I think you jokingly say, I don't know why I didn't go to University of Toronto and just visit the guy since he had such an impact on me. A lot of people in America know Marshall McLuhan because he has that cameo in Woody Allen's Annie Hall where he pulls him out from beside in a movie theater. Obviously you know that. Marshall McLuhan says to an NYU professor, you don't know the first thing about what I'm on any of my theories. So I think you do know the first thing about his theories. I think it's interesting because you, as an animator and someone who created so many tens of thousands of hours of television and movies, that the idea that the content is really derives from the medium itself, that the message is the content, meaning that the delivery system, how the person consumes the culture or consumes the art, becomes the message apart from its underlying message. And I think that in a funny way, animation is a really good exhibit for that, right?
No, absolutely. And not only is the medium affect how we view it and how we consume it, but it also affects how we make it. So when we're working with digital tools, we think differently. We, make different decisions about how we're going to draw a character. So the actual design of the characters changes as the technology changes, and it's no longer just an artist with pencil on paper. And that
And
would,
color, right? Color itself through the deployment, the message machinery has a lot to do with the way it's being consumed, right? That the fact
yeah.
that animation hits you with lots of color and images that in some ways colors your understanding of what is being conveyed.
And for sure, once you're in the digital world, you have the unlimited palette that I was describing before, and that
Right.
changes what kind of films you make. It changes how people look at it and how they enjoy it. And the same thing is true as you move into CGI from what is traditional 2D animation. And then in 2D animation, when you move from traditional animation to flash animation, which is a totally digital form,
Well,
or some of
let's
the
hold
other.
off on that because I want to get to the metaverse at some point because I'm going to hear what you think about that as you'll take us through the various technologies. You also mentioned Joseph Campbell, worth mentioning because he's oftentimes not discussed when it comes to people that make art because among other things, he's known for creating the concept of the hero and the journey of the hero, and that you watch the hero sort of gets identified. The hero is confronted with a number of challenges. He or she somehow survives the challenges, and then it's not over. He somehow or she has to come back and provide the wisdom or the benefit from those. So even the story of Hercules is a good example, but all cowboy westerns seem to be filled with these Joseph Campbell, the myth making of the hero.
Yeah, so I
Um,
learned about it. I learned about Joseph Campbell's work and his analytical thoughts from George Lucas, who was consumed by Joseph Campbell, very influenced by him in the construction of
and
Star
he
Wars.
helped start your career.
Absolutely. We're at a point where we had just done our first animated special called A Cosmic Christmas. George Lucas was looking for an animation company to produce a 10-minute short where we got a chance to introduce the Star Wars character Boba Fett, who became a very important character in the Star Wars lore. But
So right, so
George
you
would
and
talk. So George would talk about Joseph Campbell at length, and would recommend everybody read Joseph Campbell. And when we started the first two series we did with George, called Ewoks and then Droids, we basically were following the sort of analytical path of Joseph Campbell.
and of course, right, and of course, the Star Wars films are all filled with that mythology of the hero. Um, the iPhone 16 just came out.
Okay.
We'll talk about this a little later as well. But you describe sort of the early days of I would say gonzo animation, making movies like the way you did with the camera on the toilet. But it does seem as if the speed, you mentioned 2D animation. I think there's something now called 3D animation.
Yeah.
What is it that Pixar added to this? And I'm
Well,
wondering now, it seems like if you watch, the introduction of the iPhone 16 launch, it sounds like as if they're basically saying all you now need is a phone to do almost anything. Now, maybe that's not true of animation, or maybe you'll say that it is, but it must be extraordinary in your lifetime to think about how you started out and how over time you benefited from all of those improvements. So, for instance, Pixar, which Disney eventually acquired, did they do anything that changed the technology?
I don't know that they changed the technology as much as they created the excitement with the first CGI motion picture, which was Toy Story. And Pixar, just as a side note, was started by George Lucas, and he eventually sold it to Steve Jobs because Lucas was trying to simplify his life, and so he was eliminating a lot of things that he had dabbled in. And his goal when he started Pixar was to be able to eventually do movies without actors, so that in those later Star Wars movies where you had characters that were totally animated, that was the payoff for all of that developmental work.
And
But
that was what he was thinking in creating Pixar.
absolutely, that was what he was driven by.
That's
And
extraordinary. Wow, that's extraordinary. So you were involved. One of the things that's interesting about your career, there isn't one phase of this that you weren't involved in. So, for instance, one of the things I was interested in reading is that it's not just that you made these things, you had to acquire the rights to these things. A lot of these things were owned by someone else. They were books that children books were reading. Your book is filled with stories of you taking people out to dinner and, basically wining and dining them and essentially convincing them to sell you the rights, the licensing rights to turn a book into a children's television show. And then I hadn't thought about this. It's through your efforts by putting it on television every Saturday morning that all of a sudden there's a toy potential that didn't exist before. So now all of a sudden there's the merchandising of characters that you brought to life through television that the most people didn't know because if they didn't read the book, they didn't know the characters existed. They saw the Michael Hirsh shows. Now they know the characters existed. The next thing you have is you have a doll, or you have a lunchbox, and you were involved in every phase of that, right?
yeah, absolutely. And a good example of that development from a great children's book to merchandise was Babar, where we adapted it. We got it on HBO in the US and we sold it all around the world. And Babar was a major merchandising vehicle for a while. And not only that, but when we turned the stories that we had written for television into books, as adapted stories, we outsold all of the Babar books that had ever been published
I
before.
love that.
Yeah, so that tens of millions of Babar books got sold that weren't by the de Bruynhofs, though it was the genius of both Jean de Bruynhof and Laurent de Bruynhof who continued those books that made it possible for us to do that, right?
Yeah, but it was the genius of Michael Hirsh to hire the writers that could come up with 65 episodes of a character or 200 episodes, right? Because what you're saying is the books that became the adaptations were the adaptations of the stories that were written by your writers in taking the character and putting the character in different situations, right?
Absolutely. And but the one thing that I have to add is we're talking about the writers. It Animation is really a team sport. So while you've been saying I did this and I did that, the truth of the matter is that one of the things I had to do was put together teams of hundreds of people, in some cases 1,000 people, in order to do a project. And it's about getting the right people in the right places, putting together the right teams, and building their confidence in doing the project that
Well,
really delivers
yeah, I
it.
mean, I suspect what you would say that was my job as the CEO of these companies. For instance, at no point in the book do you ever say that you did the painting on any of those films. You may be responsible as the person that had 6 different companies that produced, hundreds of thousands of hours of television for children and cartoons, but you were the one that had to put together all of the teams, from the people that did the writing, for the people that did the development, production, the people that acquired the rights. You hired the lawyers that represented you to acquire the rights. You had to wine and dine. I remember, I don't know if there's that. I'm sure you don't even care about it, but I was thinking about that. It was a failed movie that they made with Tom Hanks about Walt Disney's efforts to acquire the rights to Mary Poppins.
Right.
It's not a very good movie, but it made me think of Michael Hirsh, because I thought that's exactly the real difficulty that he had in dealing with a woman who was ambivalent about having this done to her simple characters. You took Babar and turned Babar into a major character that had dolls that were being sold in FAO Schwartz, and that would have never happened without you turning it first into a television show.
One of my favorite sort of examples of exactly what you're speaking about is Maurice Sendak,
Yeah.
who had largely resisted any entertainment being done. He had done a special based upon a series of books that he had. I think they were called the Nutshell books. I'm not getting the title exactly right. Carole King did the music. It was a TV special. And then he did nothing in entertainment for years and years. And we were able to convince him to do Little Bear. And interestingly enough, he trusted us with his work, because when he had seen Babar, and he was a big Babar fan, he thought we had enhanced Babar and made
Oh,
it,
wow.
you know, even better than it was. And he
You,
loved Babar.
I don't want you to talk about this because we have too many things to talk about, but you do have a very funny anecdote in the book about when he was signing the books and the merchandising at FAO Schwartz. People would drive down with their copies of Where the Wild Thing, where the Wild Things Are, or
Or any
whatever,
book.
right, or any of his other books, and he
Yeah.
refused to sign them. So I guess
There
he
was a
was
sign.
ambivalent.
There was a sign beside him saying, "I'm only signing Little Bear."
I only signed this one thing.
People
So the other thing
drove.
that's interesting about the book, and then you mentioned Carole King, the book is ridiculous, and who you ended up befriending and working with because of their voice, because they became the voices for characters in your various shows. And I mean, I just, either whether we're talking about Jim Henson or Tim Burton, you did a show for Beetlejuice, Bob Iger at Disney, of course, but Debbie Harry, Lou Reed, Paul McCartney, Roseanne Barr, the Bee Gees. I love that anecdote about the Bee Gees and how they wanted it to be about them, and you had a much better idea than about him. I love the anecdote about Sid Caesar coming to your house. That's a generational thing. Not everyone will get that. Alan Ladd Sr., Whoopi Goldberg, Mr. T, Alicia Silverstone ended up being an executive producer for you. Even our friend in one of the movies that you made that was an actual feature film, Malice, starring Nicole Kidman and Alec Baldwin. Alec has done a couple events for us before. So I'm going to tell him that we had a little cross Alec Baldwin piece here. So with all of that and the SCTV crowd, is there anything that I know that George Lucas was a huge influence on you, but are any of these other people that impart any wisdom that you could share, or any anecdote? I mean, there was a very funny anecdote with Roseanne Barr at Cannes, but I'm wondering whether, given the fact that you spent so much time dealing with egos and getting people to see things being adapted in a way that wouldn't be obvious to them, like Maurice Sendak is a good example, right? Convincing them that there's another life for this. You must have convinced Alicia Silverstone so much that she decided she wanted to be the executive producer, that she went beyond just giving her voice. So I'm wondering, either is there a lesson here for people that are aspiring deal makers in the entertainment business that you can impart, or is there something that you learn from any of these people that you want to impart?
So in general, I think what I learned from a lot of the musicians was the importance of the muse, the artist's muse. Almost all of the musicians that we worked with who wrote songs for us, and you went through a long list, they basically could write songs in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And if the song didn't come to them quickly, they would generally walk away from what they were doing and come back
Didn't
to
that
it.
happen with Gibb?
It happened with Gibb on a project we never made.
I know, but you said he wrote the song in 10 minutes.
Yeah, so we basically came up with an idea based upon.
This is Barry Gibb, right?
Yeah, this is Barry Gibb. And he left the room. His brothers were sitting around talking to us. And he came back 10 minutes later and sang a song that summed up the whole movie we were talking about, right? It just was perfect. John Sebastian was one of the first artists I worked with who was famous for being the lead of Loving Spoonful and did Summer City, Welcome Back, and other great songs. And he could write the song in front of you in a few minutes. And if he didn't, then you had to leave it and then come back to it. So the importance of the muse is really something that is critical in music. And of course, it's true in the arts. And so when you're working with great actors and actresses and comedians, you really have to listen to what they're proposing, what they're saying. And I think that was one of the main lessons that I kind of learned was the importance of listening as compared to like talking down and telling people do this, do that. And you have to be able to identify when somebody creates something in the spur of the moment that's better than what was being contemplated.
You reminded me of something in the book. You meant you attributed to your father, but as you were describing how quickly the songs came to them, as if the muse was working or it wasn't working. You had that in your own experience as a deal maker and business executive and entertainment in the idea of making decisions decisively.
Yes.
I thought that was an interesting anecdote because you don't normally think that people in your position believe that. They think it should be, deliberate, you labor over the idea forever, you hem and haw. You don't believe that.
It was very important for me to always have a sense of what I wanted to do and what I thought the company should do. And being able to make quick decisions on the spot and decide, and my answer was almost always yes. I can't remember, very rarely would I have said no. And it's really one of the rules of improvisation, but I think it works in life as you're building a business or a career. It's opportunity that you build on. And if you say no, you lose opportunity. And you've got to just keep doing things till you get those opportunities that turn into success, and you can build on that.
So what happened? I know that when you and I were kids, you grew up in New York as well. There were 3 television shows, and then eventually there was cable television. There was really very little options, but it does seem as if cartoons and animation developed around the amassing of these more platforms.
Yes.
Where did this all come from? Nickelodeon channel, there are all of these, we had, of course, PBS and Sesame Street, but all these other networks popped up, right? Was this all because of cable or because of something else?
Yeah, it was because of cable. But essentially, it was fulfilling a demand. There was a limited amount of air space that could be used to make new channels. And the economics of network television were very, very tough. So it was a long time before you had the 4th and 5th networks. So when Nickelodeon started, it started as just a way to sell cable. So interestingly enough, the people who were laying cable and going into a city and getting the rights to lay cable in that city would come in and say, and if you let us lay cable in your city, we're going to bring you a children's channel and we'll bring you an all news channel, which was
But you're saying they didn't have it.
no. And basically, this got built in the 80s. So the cable in the US got laid in the 80s. And the channel that was probably the most influential in getting people interested in having cable were pay TV. So Showtime and HBO were the two leading agents for selling
Yeah, but
cable.
Michael, you should tell the audience, for them who don't remember of a certain generation, when HBO came up, there was just a box with a channel that switched to HBO on up top of the TV, and it only had 2 or 3 hours of TV every night. It was just one or two movies. That was HBO, right? It wasn't a huge, step up.
But they made it huge by putting it on cable, and then it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And
So you're saying the box was separate from the cable?
Yes. So essentially, before they brought the cable in, they had a small device, and I'm not sure was it home box office, maybe, and then it evolved.
Yeah, that's why it was called. Yeah, that's why it was called home box office, because
in Canada, interestingly enough, because all of our cities are thousands of miles apart or 1,000 miles apart, we had cable in the 50s.
Oh,
we didn't
wow.
have cable channels and we didn't have pay TV, but we had cable, and that was to bring in distant signals, and that happened in the States too. But people only bought cable in a big way. Cable penetrated when they were offered the USA Network, Nickelodeon, and then the cable channels started to become more and more attractive as a package for the cable companies.
So your career, in some ways, which is the chicken and the egg hypothesis, is it because you were creating more content and because there needed to be more platforms to showcase it, or did you see the potential of these new shows? The guys laying the cable were making promises that they eventually had to deliver. At some point, somebody had to put up television shows for kids, and you were going to make them.
Yeah, so we had begun to succeed before cable came in, but cable accelerated our growth. It allowed us to do our first live action TV series, The Edison Twins. It allowed us to do, lots and lots of shows that eventually we were producing 20 series. And what was happening in the United States and had happened in Canada was also happening in Europe and in Asia. And so the growth of cable around the world drove the demand internationally for these shows. So there was really a large demand. When I started when we started making network television shows of our own, like the Care Bear series, a TV episode on a global basis was worth $25,000 a half hour outside of North America. But 15 years later, with the full cable penetration and exposure, those shows were now worth $250,000 a half hour.
Wow.
So there was a tenfold increase in the value because you could sell the same episode to cable, to free TV in every country in the world.
So there was a wild, wild west of the expansion of content, right? Because
absolutely, it was an explosion, and really,
yeah.
So that was what drove our growth as a company, was that extra demand, and because we were really good at getting the rights to great properties, right? Books and movie spin-offs and original ideas, and we became the most successful independent production company in animation on a worldwide basis.
I think most people are unconscious and how revolutionary the technology in a very short time period. Because I said, I started out as a kid, there was 3 channels in PBS, that was it. Then there was this HBO box called Home Box Office that you could see 2 movies a night. That was it. They didn't produce anything. They just had 2 older movies within the last year that came out. But then think about cable, VCR, CD players, DVR, video on demand, streaming. I mean, your career has covered this entire swath of this revolutionary differences in technology that in the end resulted in the consumption of content that would have just been impossible without these various different mechanisms.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that streaming is the first new addition to distribution methodology that's killing the legacy businesses. When home video came in, it didn't kill network television or syndicated
Even
television.
though, oh, but 1 second, Michael, even though there was a case that went to the Supreme Court, the Sony Betamax case,
Right.
right? I mean, this is a little, American legal nuance, but the film studios hated the Sony Betamax. They didn't know that it would help their business. They thought it was going to hurt their business.
And it dramatically increased their business. What happens in media is that every time there's a new form of distribution until streaming, it just adds another layer where everybody wants to have their favorite movie. And if they had it on video cassette, but now they've got DVDs, they'll go on and buy it again on DVD. And essentially, all these other businesses were additive, whereas streaming is so effective and it's so much the best medium for consumers that it's killing consumers wanting to watch entertainment on legacy media.
So can you explain why is it killing them? You're saying this is actually the first time that they cried wolf, and they have a point.
Yes, absolutely. This is 100% correct. So why is it killing it? Because if you think about streaming, you have this bigger offering than ever before because they have unlimited shelf space. It's digital. Secondly, you can start watching a show and pause it, and you can come back 6 months or a year later and pick up where you left off. Thirdly, you can move it around with you. You can go to Europe, you can go to Asia, you can go to Africa. It doesn't matter. You can watch a streaming show from wherever you are. And all of that just makes it easy. You can watch it on your phone. You can watch it on your TV. You can watch it on your iPad. You can watch it on your computer. So the flexibility of the medium really is a perfect consumer offering. And so, you don't have to be there at appointment viewing. You can watch it when you want. It's available
And
to you.
it's very different from the model of I have a ticket and I have to keep buying a ticket in order to see it. And that's not what streaming, right? Streaming overcomes the I have to buy another ticket to see it again, right? You're saying it's just there.
Yeah. So what that's done is it's created ubiquity, and and it's going to be harder to make a hit in the streaming world because making a hit was based in part on scarcity. Oh, it's Thursday night. I've got to go watch Seinfeld at whatever time it was on, 9 o'clock. If I'm not home at 9, I can't watch it. And so you had to go out of your way to actually enjoy and follow your favorite show. Now it's always available, and you can binge watch. You can watch all the shows all at once if that's your mood.
So when we go back to McLuhan and the medium is a message, do you think that in a way? So it was just a couple of weeks ago, Michael. You'll love this because we had a little talk earlier about The Godfather. But I had never seen The Godfather on a big screen before because it came out when I was 12 years old. I had never seen it. I've seen it 100 times since. So the Museum of Modern Art devoted this month to showing classic movies of the 70s.
Yeah.
They showed Harold and Maude and The Godfather 1 and 2 and Marathon Man. They showed a number of. So I went with my kids, and they're adults too. We all went. It was exceptional to see, but it did remind me of what life was like when you and I were kids in New York,
Right.
where you go and there was hundreds of people in a movie theater all watching this at the same time, seeing it on a wide screen. Given the fact that you are a content producer of television and films, do you think that what you've described as a killer of the legacy institutions, that it's also a killer for the consumer also in a way that they don't realize?
I don't think it kills the consumer, but it changes the consumer. It changes their relationship to what they're viewing, because they can watch it anytime, right? And they can watch it anywhere. All of the factors that we just discussed really fundamentally changes the relationship. And so when I think about, you earlier on, we were talking about going to a matinee as a kid,
Yeah.
and seeing a double bill with, cartoons and news trailers. Well, that experience is gone, right? You don't have to do that on Saturday. That was a Saturday matinee. That was what it was.
Well, it goes back to the point you said before about the people that are in the streaming business now know that I've been reading, I'm sure you follow this much more closely than I do, that actors are very upset that movies are being made on the promise, studios like Apple or Paramount Plus, that they will get a commercial release, and then they get a commercial release for like 2 weeks. That's it. Or not at all. They go straight to the streaming channel. And the actors hate that. So does the director. They want people to come and watch it on big widescreen TVs. There was a thought last summer, right, with Barbie and Oppenheimer, that we would continue to have that, but we didn't. That did not, to my knowledge, that did not happen this summer, where people would go back and forth to see a movie on a wide screen. So, I'm just wondering that even the talent doesn't like it, right? I mean, everyone is trying to figure out how to monetize it, but the economies have made it impossible. You make these movies, you spend a lot of money, but in the end, you don't want to distribute them through movie theaters.
No, and the other factor that contributes to that is that steadily over time, the cost of a large screen TV came way down. People have very nice sets in their homes with very nice audio. You can take build a very excellent home audio theater. And so you're watching it often with quality of movie theater. And people are happy not to leave their homes and to not pay for the parking and not, buy all the candy, et cetera, that you do when you go to the movie. So it's really, again, I think McLuhan nailed it, because again, the technology, the medium that we're watching it on changes what we make. So the kinds of movies change, because in order to get you to a big screen, well, we got to have IMAX. We got to have a movie that's worthy of being on IMAX, right? So fewer movies are made in that category.
I hate to tell you this, Michael. I don't know how you'll feel about it, but it won't surprise you. If we had done this event 5 years ago, we would have flown you in and we would have done it in front of a live audience. Now we only do like a third, if not half of our programs live in New York. Sometimes we do them in other cities. But it was the pandemic and the technology that changed everything. And now we do it this way. It's very convenient. You're in Toronto, we can do it much more easily. But we have board members that really just prefer the live events. They just say, well, we should always do live events. Bring Michael Hirsh in. We should just do live. So it's not just Peacock and Paramount Plus and Apple. Even FOLCS, a nonprofit, has these same considerations. There's a cheaper way to make these things, and we've gotten good at it. But it's not what we started out doing. We started out, bringing in Bill Clinton and Supreme Court justices and actors and Nobel Prize winners in a purely live setting. Let me just talk a little about, since we're talking about content, with YouTube. I know that you have YouTube channels throughout many, not anymore, but through the companies that you created. There became this term of art of like content is king, right? But that also content is free. And that people assume that they should be able to watch. I think in your book, you pointed out that YouTube has made it possible for you to see every single thing that you've ever made, which is, to me, astounding, because you've made tens of thousands of things, but you can watch every single thing, even the stuff from the early days of Michael Hirsh. But you don't get paid. You don't get paid for it if I look at something that you made in the 70s.
No, but you get paid if you get a big audience, so enough of an audience to sell commercials around. Secondly, you get paid if you're the copyright owner. So the reality is that because
who makes that payment? YouTube?
Yeah, YouTube sells advertising, and they have a very favorable split for the creators. They basically only take 45%, leave you with the majority, and yet they have to support a platform that's the largest TV viewing platform in the world. And they sell the advertising, and that costs money, and they share that revenue with people who get enough views. So that's what's exciting. What's exciting about YouTube for the young people who are listening to us today is that if you're an artist and you want to start your career, you can, without curation, put what you want on YouTube, and you can build an audience, and you can do the work yourself. It's really a great DIY, do-it-yourself platform.
But that goes to a point that you make in the book that I think you're picking up now, is that the democratization of the technology has made, content, right, made it possible with digital filmmaking and YouTube and TikTok for you to have a platform with just buy the technology yourself, create the content and put it out there.
That's right. And that's fantastic. When I started off, I started as an experimental filmmaker making films in high school, and I had to go to an open screening and show my things, to an audience, and the audience might be 20, 30 people.
Wait,
Well,
can
if
you
you
explain that to the audience? That was some theater owner made a theater available for guys like you?
It was in New York, and there was the filmmakers co-op that would have an open screening night,
I
and then there
see.
was a group in Spanish Harlem called Eventorium, and they did the same thing. And I would make my film with my high school friends, and we would pop down and show it, and that was great. But today, if I was doing the same thing, I'd make the film, put it on YouTube, and if it catches on, you can have millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people who are watching your show. And if you get into that kind of a stratosphere, you're actually making real money. And then you
And
build the property and the brand. And now you've got a brand that you own and control because you haven't built it with Netflix or with CBS or ABC.
yeah, but it doesn't foreclose you, Michael, right? For Netflix's people to call you up and say, I
So that's
saw
what
this.
happened. That
Yeah,
is
I
what
saw
happened.
what you're doing. You're pretty good at this, and you've built an audience already. Thank you very much for building up our marketing up before we didn't have to do it for you. You did it yourself. I assume that's another way that we're going to start to see the next generation of filmmakers, not necessarily even through film schools.
Absolutely. And when you look at some of these, these kids, I use the term loosely, but some of them started at, 6, 7. There's a kid named Ryan who was the unboxer of toys, and he makes millions of dollars a year. And there are a lot of these people who, as they grow up, they've become quite successful and are well off, and they can redeploy their money in making more content and
So
improving the
you're saying
quality.
the students at the New York Film Academy, our partners, in theory, can take what they've learned and instead of doing what you did and try to find a night where there's a co-op, they can put a finished product up there that was
Absolutely.
produced by a student who really learned how to make movies through the New York Film Academy.
Absolutely.
And
And they're probably doing it.
they're
I'd
doing it
be
right now.
I'd be shocked if they're not doing it.
I love it. Well, if you're in Los Angeles and you're a student at the New York Film Academy, I hope you're smiling because Michael's gave you an anecdote about what it looked like for him when he was a young filmmaker. And now while you're at the New York Film Academy, you can actually both generate some content fees and you can get the attention of a studio. A couple more questions and then we'll maybe see, and then we'll say goodnight or take a question from the audience. Let me see. Uh, there's something that I wanted to talk about. Briefly, the 2008 financial crisis. Just explain why something that really was about the foreclosure of houses ended up having an impact on your business.
So because there was a near meltdown of the economy, not only in the United States, but in Canada and the rest of the world, advertisers started to spend less on television. And so you had a situation where the revenue stream, there were two revenue streams typically in television. One was advertising and the other was subscription for, cable and pay channels, right? And so the advertising revenue went way down. The second thing is everybody was concerned about the collapse of the economy. So people started to pull back, like broadcasters and other commissioners of shows started to pull back making as much content because they wanted to preserve cash, not sure how things were going to work out. And in the case of my company at the time, which was called Cookie Jar, we had made our second acquisition and had just bought a company called Deke and had borrowed $80 million to buy Deke. And then there's the economic collapse. So all of a sudden, currencies are in fluctuation. And so currencies started to be devalued, and we started to get paid in what was the equivalent of, say, 60-cent dollars, 70-cent dollars. And essentially that threw us off our financial position. But that happened to a lot of people. A lot of people all of a sudden didn't have the orders that they were used to getting, and you have overhead. So you basically are in a tough financial strait until the market comes back, you know.
But but the pandemic didn't have the same effect.
The
Right? The
pandemic,
pandemic, ironically, allowed content producers to do better.
well, particularly in animation, because whereas in live action, people had to shut down their shoots, you know, because there was a fear of contamination and people getting sick and making each other ill.
I see.
And
So
by
there was
law, they were forced to stop shooting. In the case of animation, we could send people home with a computer and they could work remotely. And literally, we didn't lose a day in that process. We
in
were
terms
well,
of the production.
yeah, and that
But that's when all the streaming, it seems like that's where Disney Plus showed up and Paramount Plus. It seems like those companies arose out of the pandemic.
Absolutely, they were impacted positively. On the other hand, there was
Netflix stock, I think, tripled, right? Something like that.
yeah, well, the viewing went way up, right? People were at home, they had more time, they weren't traveling back and forth to the office, so the amount of time you had to spend viewing was increased, and you weren't traveling, right? You weren't
Right.
going on vacation, etc. You were staying home.
One last question. We'll say goodnight to Michael. I'm afraid we're not going to have any time for questions tonight, gang. Sorry. This is something that goes back to both your personal background and your philosophy background. It's a sentence in your book that struck me as very unusual for a filmmaker and the creator of content, which is that you are a child of Holocaust survivors on both sides of your family. Your father was an Auschwitz survivor. Obviously, the experience, the post-Holocaust world affected you and made you the person you are. And you say that in the book, even as a businessman. And yet, you recognize something without mentioning the 20th century philosopher Theodor Adorno, who wrote No Poetry After Auschwitz, which meant do not make art out of atrocity. If something is unimaginable, it's beyond the capacity of someone to imagine. If it's unspeakable, then it's beyond the capacity of somebody to say things. I was in a documentary years ago in which I played like the howling wolf, where everyone, including Steven Spielberg, said, we shouldn't make movies, but we will. And I kept saying, well, maybe we shouldn't. Why do we keep saying we shouldn't, but we will? You actually said, I've never heard of anyone like you who actually is in the business of making stuff, where you said, I really didn't think it would be appropriate to turn something that is so atrocity, into, and can mix it with aesthetics.
Yeah, and one of the thoughts that drove that was an observation that it's very hard to make anything look awful on film. There's something about capturing, you know, whether it's the lighting, whether it's the, you know, actors being really good, whatever it is, that you never see anything that looks as horrible as it is in real life. And so for me, my vision of the Holocaust was based upon the stories I heard from my father, which was about blood, people dying, vomit, you know, horrible things. And basically, my feeling was that you could never really attempt to show it the way it was, and any attempt would fail. And so I didn't feel I had, you know, I had the right to do that, and particularly growing up with my father's stories.
Michael, you have no idea the humility and modesty of what you just said. Is I followed it. I've written about this for the New York Times and other places over the years extensively. So it really struck out. It stuck out of the book because if you follow some of the things I wrote, I've been, you know, I've heard no one in your position ever says that. Nobody. The sense of respect and humility. Everyone assumes they can tell the story authentically and appropriately and properly. And anyway, I just thought you should know how unusual that was and how rare as an artist for you to say that sense of humility. All right, before we say goodnight to Michael, we've got a couple announcements for some upcoming events and then some closing remarks. Yes, we have a conversation on Sunday the 29th which the Wiggles, some of you have grown up with this Musical Education Act. In fact, even Michael Hirsh had a hand in bringing them from Australia to the United States. So there wasn't even that is something Michael Hirsh was involved in. We have some of the original cast and some of the current cast of the Wiggles. They're going to be going on a national tour throughout the United States. And we've got, yes, we have a co-production with Jazz at Lincoln Center. There is a piece of music that was written, original piece of music by the award-winning musician Brian Carter in honor of the civil rights activist Bayard Rustin. So it's a night honoring and celebrating Bayard Rustin with music that has been created by Brian Carter in commemoration of Rustin. There's a QR code for that. And then we've got a couple, I think one that we're prepared to announce tonight and another. We have one that is live. This is going to be a live event. Those other two events are on Zoom and through our studio here at the FOLCS studio. This is a Broadway show called Vladimir, and it's about a journalist during the first election of Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin is in the news as always. This is we have the director of the play, the great Daniel Sullivan, and a number of the cast members will be. It'll be at the theater after one of the performances. We'll do one of the conversations. So here's an idea. Come to New York on October 30th. Michael, come in. You might enjoy it. Watch the. We've done a few of these. We did one with John Turturro last year in an adaptation of Philip Roth's Sabbath Theater, and then the Tom Stoppard play Leopoldstadt, which, by the way, Michael, it speaks to your family's history. Stoppard actually is also a child of the survivor of the Holocaust, and he made this play that we did with the cast after. For donations, here's a good QR code. We're always happy to hear from you. We don't charge anymore online. It's all been as a public service. So that's your donate button, QR code. And of course, we want to hear from you and join our community so that you can get invitations for what we had here tonight with the great Michael Hirsh. Michael, I want to thank you for being our guest tonight. I'm encouraging our audience to buy your book and to go on various different platforms and see these incredible contributions to world culture that you've made. You've built an incredible career and an incredible library of both entertainment and a public service to children around the world. So thank you for that, Michael.
Thank you, Thane.
All right, good night, everyone. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS. Until next time.